Picture this. You're walking down a dusty road, absolutely 100% convinced you are doing righteous work by hunting down insurgents. And then, suddenly, according to the ancient texts anyway, you're stopped dead in your tracks by a blinding light and a booming voice from the heavens. That dramatic, celestial interruption on the road to Damascus didn't just stop a killer in his tracks, it arguably changed the entire course of Western civilization. Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the thrilling history and, honestly, the incredibly dense philosophy of early Christianity's most prolific figure, the Apostle Paul. We'll be neutrally unpacking the ancient texts, from the wild narratives in the Book of Acts to his famous epistles, to understand exactly who this guy was, the crazy things he survived, and the revolutionary ideas he left behind. All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're breaking this down into 5 parts. 1, the radical conversion. 2, journeys, trials, and shipwrecks. 3, faith, law, and spirit. 4, the supremacy of love. And finally, 5, the ultimate victory. Kicking things off with Section 1, the radical conversion, from hunter to hunted. So to really understand Paul, you first have to understand Saul of Tarsus. This guy wasn't just your everyday skeptic. He was a fiercely religious Pharisee, totally obsessed with hunting down and imprisoning early believers of what was then called the Way. The Book of Acts paints a pretty terrifying picture here, describing Saul as literally breathing out murderous threats. He was actively casting votes for the executions of early Christians. But the text claims that on his way to Damascus, armed with arrest warrants, he's hit by a light brighter than the sun and is struck completely blind. It's only days later, when a very cautious early disciple prays for him, that literal scales supposedly fall from his eyes. Literally in a matter of days, the ultimate hunter becomes the hunted, and he immediately starts preaching the exact same message he was trying to wipe out. It's a complete 180. Moving right along to Section 2, journeys, trials, and shipwrecks, a life on the road.
That radical shift leads straight into a literal masterclass in human endurance. Once Paul took up this mantle, the sheer physical toll of his travels is just staggering. It's like something out of an action movie. Look at this trajectory. He isn't just taking leisurely trips, he's constantly moving from one crisis or hostile mob to the next. From that intense conversion in Damascus, he ends up in Philippi, where he's thrown in jail, moves on to intellectually sparring with philosophers in Athens, miraculously survives a brutal shipwreck off Malta, and eventually ends up preaching in Rome under Roman guard. It is wildly chaotic.
Just to give you a sense of how dramatic these stops actually got, check out what happens in Philippi. Paul and his companion Silas are stripped, severely beaten with rods, and thrown into the deepest, darkest inner cell of a prison with their feet locked in stocks. And their response? At midnight, they're just praying and singing hymns. And then, the story goes, that a violent earthquake shakes the foundation so hard that the prison doors fly open. The jailer wakes up, sees the doors, and is so terrified of the Roman penalty for letting prisoners escape that he draws his sword to kill himself, but Paul shouts out and saves the man's life. That profound act of mercy leads directly to the jailer and his entire household getting baptized that very same night. But here's the thing. Paul wasn't just surviving physical trauma, he was an absolute intellectual chameleon. In Acts 17, he gets to Athens and is deeply distressed by all the idols around the city. But instead of just yelling at people on the streets, he goes straight to the Areopagus to debate the heavy hitters, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And he brilliantly adapts his message to them. He actually points out an altar they had already built dedicated to an unknown god. He uses their own culture, even their own poets, to introduce his theology of a god who doesn't live in temples built by human hands. Pretty clever, right?
Now this number here, 276, is fascinating. Later in his life, while he's being shipped off to Rome as a prisoner, Paul's ship gets caught in a hurricane-force wind for 14 terrifying days. It's pitch black, they throw the cargo overboard, they're starving, and basically everyone gives up all hope. But Paul stands up and tells him he had a vision. Not a single life will be lost, only the ship. And exactly as he predicted, the ship gets violently dashed against a sandbar off the coast of Malta, but all 276 souls on board manage to swim or float on planks to safety. Every single one of them.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, faith, law, and spirit, the core theology. So we transition now from his crazy physical survival to his towering intellectual legacy. Because Paul wasn't just a traveler, he was a prolific writer. The letters he wrote to early churches in places like Rome and Galatia laid down these incredibly complex theological frameworks. At the very heart of his epistles is a deep dichotomy. Remember, Paul was a former strict Pharisee.
Yet he argues in his letter to the Romans that the strict written law, which relies purely on human works and rule following, ultimately just brings what he calls the consciousness of sin. It basically just highlights humanity's fatal flaws. In stark contrast, he introduces the law of the Spirit, which relies entirely on faith and, he argues, brings true life, peace, and total freedom from condemnation.
The crucial takeaway here is how his texts define grace. In Romans 3, Paul makes it super clear that no one is naturally righteous, not Jew, not Gentile, nobody. Therefore, justification, which means being made right with God, cannot possibly be a reward for perfectly following the rules. Instead, he frames it as an entirely unearned gift, given freely through grace, meant to be received purely by faith. Do you see what he's doing here? He completely levels the religious playing field for all people.
Now, you might be wondering, did this grace just mean people could do whatever they wanted? Well, no. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul argues that if you are truly guided by the Spirit, it's going to produce very specific, tangible results in how you live. He contrasts the acts of the flesh, things like hatred, discord, and selfish ambition, with these very famous attributes known as the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. And he points out that against such things there is no law.
Which brings us to Section 4, the supremacy of love, action over emotion.
Out of all those fruits of the Spirit, out of all the intense religious practices and theological insights Paul had, he elevates one single thing absolutely above all others. In what's probably his most famous piece of writing, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul delivers this devastating critique to a really fractured church. He basically tells them, look, you can have the most spectacular faith, you can fathom all mysteries, possess all knowledge, or literally give everything you own to the poor, but if you do not have love, you are absolutely nothing. Without love, he argues, all that impressive religious activity is just empty, annoying noise. You're just a clanging cymbal.
And then he breaks down exactly what love actually is. And notice what's missing here. It is not some fleeting, romantic emotion. Paul defines love as an indispensable, rigorous, and completely selfless action. It's patient. It's kind. It is never boastful, proud, or self-seeking. It literally keeps no record of wrongs. For Paul, love is the ultimate metric of a successful spiritual life because it is the exact mindset of Christ, who, as he wrote to the Philippians, humbled himself to the interests of others. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the ultimate victory, conquering the final enemy. For all his intense focus on how to live right now in the present, Paul's theology is also deeply anchored in the future, specifically the afterlife. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tackles the heavy skepticism of his day head-on, asking the exact questions his critics were throwing at him. How are the dead raised? What kind of body will they even have? If you think about it, that is the ultimate human question about mortality, isn't it? So let's look at how he builds this argument. He uses this brilliant agricultural metaphor. He says, when you plant a seed, you aren't planting the mature, fully grown plant. You're planting a simple, perishable seed that has to essentially die in the ground to be transformed into something else. He compares our current physical natural bodies to that perishable seed, sown in weakness and dust. But, he argues, through resurrection, it is raised as a spiritual body, imperishable, glorious, and heavenly. The perishable, he says, must clothe itself with the imperishable. And because of this guaranteed transformation, Paul absolutely insists that death is not the end. It's simply the last enemy to be destroyed. He quotes ancient prophets to deliver this triumphant, almost mocking taunt against mortality itself. If Christ was raised, he argues, then resurrection is the ultimate, final victory over humanity's greatest fear. Death is entirely swallowed up in victory. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've traced the history today. We've seen Paul beaten with rods, chased out of towns by angry mobs, thrown in jail, and literally shipwrecked in the Mediterranean. Yet from the very depths of that intense, unimaginable physical trauma, he wrote to the Romans that absolutely nothing in all creation, neither height nor depth, neither angels nor demons, nor life nor death, can separate us from the love of God. So, if a man who suffered that profoundly could maintain an unshakable, joyous hope, how does his ancient perspective challenge the way you and I view our own modern suffering? Thanks for exploring this amazing text with me today. I really hope this explainer leaves you fascinated and eager to dig into the sources for yourself.